Donald Trump's lawyer walking back comments he recently made suggesting that the president could agree to take more questions if it becomes necessary from special counsel Mueller. Today, though, in a new interview with Hill TV, Rudy Giuliani says Mueller's team won't get any more answers from Trump.
Do you expect that he's going to have to answer more questions in writing?
Well, I think I announced about 10 days ago over my dead body, and I'm not dead yet. So
that answers that. As a former
he's not answering any more questions from these people. Their outrageous activity. We did enough.
Talking tough, did enough. But Giuliani also said a day earlier something a little different, speaking to the Daily Beast, because, as a lawyer, he's constantly talking to reporters. He outlined how negotiations over whether Mueller could question the president actually remained open. We'll show it to you. He was asked if his understanding was that Mueller could still look to interview Trump, whether it's over the phone or in person, etc. And Giuliani says, well, it hasn't been formally closed yet. Trump's legal team submitted those written answers to Mueller's team last month. Now, those questions, according to all public accounts that we know about, Mueller's team hasn't confirmed it or anything, but they were allegedly linked to Russian interference. That was the focus. So things could change if Mueller subpoenas the president to talk about follow-up questions or other topics entirely. And Giuliani did one other thing today that lawyers don't usually do for their clients. He went from making a legal defense, which is totally kosher, you explain your client's position within the eyes of the law, to making a personal defense, literally offering a personal alibi for Trump's conduct during the end of the campaign.
I was with the president, the last 4 months of the campaign, virtually all day and into the night until he went back to his home. And there was no contact with WikiLeaks, none.
I'm joined by former federal prosecutor Joyce Vance and Jennifer Rubin back with me. Joyce, have you ever seen a lawyer make that kind of argument? Not only do I have a kind of a legal case for my client, but by the way, I spend all my time with him and I know he couldn't have done anything wrong.
A lawyer who makes those sorts of allegations, particularly a lawyer who doesn't appear to be actively engaged in lawyering with this particular client, really runs perilously close to becoming a fact witness that prosecutors might want to question. And that seems to be what Giuliani does here. I mean,
yeah, when you say fact witness, that's one of those things that lawyers talk about. It's like the way that Rod Rosenstein, who is Mueller's boss, ultimately might be called in to confirm or deny certain underlying facts, right? You're suggesting that Rudy opens himself up to that if his claim is, I watched everything and we never contacted WikiLeaks?
The lawyer-client privilege would protect legal communications between an attorney and his client, but this looks to be in an entirely different realm, this sort of vouching that Rudy's engaging in. Yeah,
and so I think what you're saying in your normally careful and even nice way is this is mad sloppy, and Rudy was not retained as a lawyer in that period. He was a campaign surrogate, and so he sort of cracked the door. Now whether he gets in trouble for it or whether Mueller doesn't care about the 87th interview is an open question. Jennifer, we heard earlier today on MSNBC from Walter Dellinger, who was Solicitor General, who argued the Jones-Clinton case, which has some precedent that tends to cut against presidents in terms of their efforts to avoid interviews and prosecutors and such. And here's what he said to me earlier tonight about the idea that Mueller may ultimately subpoena Trump in 2019.
If the special counsel wants to know what Donald Trump's state of mind is, if he's considering perhaps even just naming him as an unindicted co-conspirator, he needs to interview the president. And I think he could easily take an expedited case on a grand jury subpoena of the president for his testimony up to the Supreme Court. They could hear that case. They could also hear a case involving the House's decision, if it comes to that, to subpoena the Mueller report.
Jennifer, do you think this is something that the White House is still worried would be on the table?
I think so. Listen, Rudy's not the real lawyer. Trump does have real lawyers. They're not very good, but he does have lawyers back there. And they are smart enough, even they, to understand that the law is not on their side. Between U.S. v. Nixon and the Paula Jones case, the judicial system's right to obtain evidence from a president, to put him under oath, to get information, is on fairly solid ground. Now, could he take an appeal to the Supreme Court and with his 2 appointees perhaps get a different ruling? Perhaps, but he's not out of the woods yet. I disagree slightly with Walter on one thing, and that is Trump may actually have revealed a good deal of the state of his mind through his tweets, through his actions, and in those written questions. So Trump has a way of telling us exactly what he's thinking and what he's doing and why. So it may be that it's not as important as it would be with another witness to get Trump under oath. But frankly, I think if Mueller feels either from a sense of completeness or because he really is lacking some facts that he needs to put him under oath and take his testimony, I don't think he'd hesitate to do it at all.
Joyce, another story that's making waves today, which Michael Cohen was quick to publicly and unequivocally deny, is this reporting that maybe there were cell phone pings that would somehow link him back to Prague. He's denied it. Those reporters stand by their story, McClatchy. Several of them have been out discussing their story tonight. Take a listen to how one of the reporters described it on All In.
This is a part of a large, wide-ranging investigation, and this part could well be, or seems to us to be, still under scrutiny.
I see.
And therefore, if he didn't have it all nailed down, I mean, it's one thing to nail down certain details, which he obviously did with regard to the lies to Congress about the Trump Tower, where, you know, the Cohen acknowledged that he contact continued for 6 months after what he previously told Congress. Our understanding is that this part is, once again, still under scrutiny.
I see.
And that, you know, it's taking more time.
Joyce, do you buy that? Because the quick counter argument to that is Mueller knows what he's doing, and Cohen's at a different place now, having been credited with credible testimony.
Yeah, it's really hard to know what to make of this story with Cohen jumping quickly onto Twitter to deny it. I suppose it's possible that Michael Cohen's phone could have been in Prague and Michael Cohen could have been someplace else. He has this interesting drop line on his Twitter feed where he says, you know, I'm told that Prague is beautiful in the spring, or whatever it is that he says. Maybe whoever had his phone is the person who conveyed that to him. One has the feeling here that this is sort of a pregnant pause, that there's more to this story. Clearly, Mueller knows where this is headed, and we don't. And I think for now it has to be just a tantalizing, unfinished detail.
Joyce Vance and Jennifer Rubin, thanks to both of you.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.